Well, good morning, folks. Let me start welcoming everyone who is now joining us, logging in. What I will ask, just as a brief kind of housekeeping rule, is if you're not a panelist, to mute your mic. You're free to keep your video on if you wish. And then if anyone has questions that they would like to pose to the panel while the discussions are going on, if you can stick that in a chat, or if you want to write it down, and then when we open up the question and answer period or a section of the webinar event, you can then submit that to us. Usually we get a lot of questions coming in. We're not able to take all of them, but what we will try to do is, as the discussions are going on, look at where there are questions, where you have common themes coming through. And then from that, we will just say, okay, we have reading out this question, but we do recognize that that other people are asking pretty much similar types of questions. So, and we're about to go live with the event. We're now live with the event on YouTube, and we'll get started with this now. So we do have a heavy morning today with all the event, the things we have to go through. So let me start off. I want to say good morning. My name is David Gomez, and we're coming to you live from London, but we're joined by our panelists in Rotterdam, here again in London, in Uganda, and we have attendees from all over the world joining us today. So welcome to everyone. This is the Ramphal Institute, and the first in a series of 4 webinars, which would examine the measures and policy tools available to Commonwealth countries to combat issues of air pollution, in particular looking at the harmful health impacts that this has had on women, children, and other vulnerable groups. This is part of a program, a wider program of work that the Ramphal Institute is undertaking with funding from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the New Delhi office for that. And the objectives of this project really are for us to try to build consensus among Commonwealth governments to adopt a common position or objectives for improved air quality in the countries. What we have recognized is that although different countries are taking different measures to deal with different aspects of air pollution, there is not yet a common Commonwealth position. And that is going to be critical for moving forward. Getting that position or agreement on that, consensus on that, is going to be critical for moving forward or advancing any position from the Commonwealth at COP26, but also in any of the other work that's being undertaken in the area of climate change. Another objective really is for us to promote stronger networking within the Commonwealth in different countries. I know in India, you do have a number of organizations that are working on the issue of air pollution. And sometimes they do work in parallel to each other. It's not that they don't talk to each other, but what we want to see if we can help to convene stronger networks or to support or strengthen working and better collaboration across in dealing with the issue of air pollution. Under the project, a series of policy briefs will be published on air pollution, dealing with different aspects of it. So clean transport, electrification and technologies, the impact of air pollution on women's livelihoods and human health, especially in urban centers, and the impact on small island development states and the challenges that they have in dealing with responding to the issues and the policy constraints that they have. So we do have one policy brief that is, well, 2 that are ready. We will publish those weekly. So the first one gets published tomorrow, the next one gets published, and then we have others coming in. And then a final part of the project is that we will convene a high-level international forum at the end of March. That's going to be a virtual forum, and we've had pretty good responses from countries The chairman of our board, the chairperson of our board, has been meeting with the deans of the different caucuses and with high commissioners to get their buy-in. There's pretty good response from that so far. As a matter of fact, a couple of the high commissions from the South Pacific said to us, "Wow, we're happy that the Ramphal Institute has come forward and is actually consulting with us on what we feel needs to be done or can be done in this area, and at least to hear what our interests are, what our needs are." So welcome to all of you in the Commonwealth and around the world, and a special welcome to our esteemed panelists joining us from Rotterdam, London, and Kampala. Dr. Lucy Gilliam is with us. She's an aviation and shipping container with Transport and Environment. Dr. Gilliam has several years of experience consulting in environmental campaigns and having previously worked as a science advisor in the UK Civil Service. She also spent 5 months as a trainee at the European Commission's Research and Innovation Directorate, working on SME policy. She is originally from the United Kingdom, and holds a BSc in biological science and a PhD in molecular biology, as well as a diploma, I like this part of it, in commercial coastal sailing vessels from Enkhuizen Nautical College. So if any of us run into problems on the shipping side of it, we can certainly turn to her and John, and not to me. I get motion sick once the boats start moving. So Dr. John Kalea is also with us on the panel this morning. He's the Technical Officer for Air Pollution at the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. He is an expert related to air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and his responsibilities include the running of the EEDI database, the IMO data collection system, and delivering IMO meetings. But he's done a lot of work around this area, and so he provides a lot of support to member countries of the IMO that are trying to look into what could be done in this area on the new agreements, etc. John completed his PhD at UCL in designing ships for lower greenhouse gas emissions. And after his PhD, he secured further research funding to develop a holistic ship energy model, led the engineer effort in a techno-economic shipping sector model. So we have absolutely the best of the experts here with us this morning. And then finally, Michael Wanyama is joining us from Uganda. Michael is the team lead and concept developer in Auto Safety Uganda, a program which has a humanitarian aspect to it, and is aimed at promoting road safety and environmental health through creation of awareness, sensitization, and capacity building from the technical standpoint of community level. So Michael does a lot of work in trying to get people to understand just basically how the gases that are emitted from all the motorbikes and cars and second-hand cars that are imported into Uganda, the impact that has on human health and societal health and women and children who use these modes of transportation. Michael is himself an automotive technician with over 10 years of experience, and he has a background in ICTs, as well as done engagement on the public sector, public health side. Before we get into the panel, I would like to give my brief take on the matter of air pollution in the transport sector. Air pollution is a challenge that all Commonwealth countries face. A first international forum convened by the Ramphal Institute in September 2018 found that air pollution was harmful or had harmful health effects on people of all ages and in all corners of the Commonwealth, indeed the entire world. Air pollution is a silent killer. We can't see the air around us or the particulates that are around us. We can see perhaps sometimes the smog that covers cities, but for the most part, it's a silent killer, and it affects not only physical, but also mental health. And get this, it is linked to poverty and social inequality in many instances. The 2018 forum put forward a number of important recommendations, including the need for greater political urgency by the Commonwealth countries for framing poor air quality as a significant public health concern, and to also espouse a rights-based approach to clean air. In recent months, the attention to the matter of air pollution has increased significantly, in part because of the realization that persons that are afflicted by respiratory illnesses caused by air pollution or just respiratory illnesses generally, um, that they tend to be more vulnerable to the coronavirus. Air pollution from transport is a major cause of poor air quality, and Commonwealth cities and countries around the world have been tackling the problems in different ways. In the United Kingdom, it was found that there is a direct link between road transport emissions and respiratory illnesses, particularly in children. And thus in London, Manchester, and Birmingham, the mayor's offices and municipal governments there have been making a concerted push towards establishing low emission zones. In Delhi, where air pollution is among the worst in the world and sometimes the highest in the world, the city has started to fight back and in 2020 launched an anti-pollution campaign. Transportation is only one of the causes of air pollution in Delhi, but it is nonetheless a key one. Hence, Delhi is now making a push for electrification of transport, is promoting investments in mass rapid transit systems, but the 11 million cars on Delhi's private cars on Delhi's roads remain a major constraint to tackling pollution in the city. Agencies like Clean Air Asia are working tirelessly and in partnership with others to address the challenges by using knowledge and collaboration to get the government to respond effectively to the problem of air pollution there. Aviation and shipping don't seem to face the same level of scrutiny as road transport does. And there are many reasons for that. Yet they are both significant causes of air pollution in Commonwealth countries. Some studies argue that very large merchant and cruise ships could emit as much pollution in a year as millions of cars do, or more than that. The rising levels of air pollution from merchant and cruise shipping has led governments of Australia, India, New Zealand, and United Kingdom, to mention a few, to take measures to address this. Many of these countries have signed on to the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, or MARPOL, and John can talk to us more about that today. However, while shipping vessels entering the maritime zones and ports of Commonwealth countries are subject to environmental laws, there tends to be still a lack of effective monitoring of air pollution. And there's also a noticeable orientation in the way that it's dealt with. Most countries tend to address the matter only from the perspective of climate change. And while there is recognition that there's an air pollution element to it, that is not picked up or addressed in any detail. So this is particularly true of small island developing states in the Commonwealth, many of who rely heavily on the tourism industry, and many of who depend as well on the cruise ships arriving for their industries to be able to be alive and vibrant. Aviation emissions also contribute to the air pollution problem. The expansion of global air travel industry in recent decades have led to significant increases in anthropogenic air pollutants. Yet, as one study recently argued, the new UN broker deal on aviation emissions will not require airlines to offset emissions for another 6 years, leading many to protest that the aviation industry has been let off easy. What does this really mean for the aviation sector in places like India, which has one of the fastest growing domestic aviation sectors in the world? How does this affect the climate change objectives of small island developing states who are heavily dependent on airlift connections and, as I said, on the arrival of cruise ships and merchant shipping for them to meet their daily subsistence needs? How can Commonwealth countries respond effectively to the various forms of transport-related air pollution? Are partnerships and collaboration needed to successfully combat this? What policies and other measures are available to small island developing states to deal with the challenges posed by air pollution? Is there a need for us to overcome the global or the greenhouse gas climate change binary in order for us to effectively deal with the health-related effects of air pollution? These questions and more are the topic form the topic of today's webinar. But let me start now by turning to Dr. Lucy Gilliam. Dr. Gilliam, you're with Transport and Environment, and we've seen certainly where your organization has been putting out a lot of information on what's happening with shipping and what's happening in the aviation sector. Tell us a little bit more about what you do and what happens with emissions in these sectors. Why they're not really they don't receive the same level of focus as road transport, for instance.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so as you said, I work for a Brussels-based NGO called Transport and Environment, and we're focused predominantly on European climate and air pollution measures for transport, and when we have members all across Europe. However, because I work on aviation and shipping, we don't just work at a EU level, we're also involved in the international processes. So we're active at the International Maritime Organization and also at ICAO. So we follow those two policy spaces. So I mean, first to kind of delve a little bit into the transport modes and your question about, you know, why do sometimes these sectors, why have they been kind of left out compared to road transport? And I think for shipping, it's you know, it's an incredibly important sector, but for the majority of people, it's very much out of sight, out of mind, and these emissions get forgotten, or there's this kind of idea, well, this is a global sector, everything has to happen at a global level, and you know, I would challenge that for two reasons. You know, actually, although shipping emissions, you know, we think of as being on the high seas, a majority of shipping is actually taking place relatively close to shore. So it, you know, the prevailing winds are blowing the shipping pollution into land, into ports. If you look at the ship tracks from kind of global satellites, you see that they're tracking very closely, and anything between half to 3/4 of air pollution in a port city could be coming from shipping. So, you know, that's one thing. You know, it is definitely a contributor towards pollution, and an important one at that. And you know, while there has been progress made at an international level with MARPOL, with regulating SOx emissions, we've got the recently implemented global sulfur cap that came in January, which makes an important contribution to bringing down sulfur emissions. You know, that we have other forms of pollution. We've got NOx and particulate matter that currently, you know, aren't regulated. So, you know, there's still an important challenge there. And even with this sulfur cap, you know, which is an important step in the right direction, if you compare it to the regulations we have for sulfur on road, you find that even with the most ambitious sulfur regulation at an EU level, we're still allowing ships to burn fuel that is 100 times more polluting than what we allow in cars on road. Now, I realize that our rules for what we can burn on road in Europe are much more ambitious than you have globally, but nonetheless, you know, you can see there is a difference there. So yeah, this is important to take into account. And you mentioned also like cruise ship pollution. Sorry, I'm focusing a little bit on shipping first, but you know, cruise ships are a particular problem because they're so large, they're consuming such high volumes of fuel compared to a regular ship. And we've done a lot of work on cruise ships looking at their air pollution, because this is where, you know, grassroots and NGO activists are very concerned about pollution. And we find that looking at cruise ships calling at European ports, that cruise ships contribute towards 10 times more sulfur pollution than all of Europe's cars. We released this report in 2018, and it really got a lot of traction around the world, because, you know, people just hadn't realized what a significant source of pollution they were. And so if you think of it so as a small island state that's maybe got cruise ships visiting, it's quite likely that that cruise ship is contributing more than the entire island's traffic pollution, for example. you know, but there are things that we can do. There are policies that we can take in Europe. You know, we're fighting for a zero emission berth standard. So this is the idea that when ships come into port, that they are zero emission, either by plugging into renewable electricity supply, or that they've stored energy on board that they can use for their duration of their port stay, or switching to alternative fuels. You can also designate emission control areas in your waters. We've done this in certain parts of Europe, in the North Sea, in the Channel Islands, in the Baltic, but any nation or group of nations can go to the IMO and designate their waters an emission control area. Other things, you know, you talk about this this conflict maybe between, you know, tackling climate, tackling air pollution. We see it as a synergy. You know, the solutions to tackle climate change are also the solutions to tackle air pollution. But what you need to do is make sure that, you know, air pollution is kind of more, you know, you want to solve it at a local level for those port communities, and having ideas around like zero emission berth standard, which on air pollution solves that problem locally, but that can also be like the segue, the starting point to decarbonize, you know, and reach our climate targets, because you start by electrifying your ships in port, and then, you know, maybe you start to electrify your short sea shipping, and then your global shipping, and with switching to alternative fuels like hydrogen, for example. One final thing I want to say on kind of solutions and policy for shipping is to bear in mind that, you know, the best thing that you can do is to burn less fossil fuels. So efficiency technologies like speed reduction, slowing down ships so they burn less fuel, so they produce less air pollutants. Deploying efficiency technologies like wind power, for example, can reduce fuel consumption and air pollution. And I know there's some great work being done by island nations looking at their shipping fleet, looking at how they can decarbonize. So I just point to some work that I know that colleagues are involved in the Marshall Islands, for example, where they're being really innovative and looking to decarbonize their shipping fleet, which will bring air pollution benefits. So that's on shipping. Aviation. Yeah, this is a huge growing problem. 90% in climate emissions growth since 1990. That also means that we've had that similar level in terms of air pollution. The biggest challenge with air pollution from aviation is from takeoff and landing, and you see that, you know, significant quantities of NOx and particulate emissions associated with aviation. Research suggests that aviation air pollution alone is contributing towards 16,000 premature deaths. Yeah, I mean, what can we do about aviation? We ultimately need to decarbonize aviation. That's not an easy task. You know, we need to be changing the fuels that planes are burning. We need to continue to make them more efficient, and maybe think about overall caps on aviation. And I know this is challenging, but, you know, globally, who are the people flying more? It's the developed nations, not the developing nations. You know, not more than 10% of the population globally has ever set foot on a plane, and the majority of aeroplane emissions and air pollution essentially are coming from a very, very tiny proportion of the global population. So what do we need to do? We need to have really good, ambitious targets, and what we're working on is, you know, we say that in Europe we need to be taking the lead in terms of switching those fuels, you know, scaling new, you know, synthetic fuels made from renewables. We need to be making sure that biofuels, for example, are only from sustainable sources, and that those very kind of rare and valuable biofuels are really only used for aviation, as this is a sector which really doesn't have very many alternatives. Just to continue on biofuels, we need to be very, very careful that we don't drive the uptake of unsustainable biofuels, i.e. Palm oil or other food crops, which can lead to significant increase in greenhouse gas emissions from land use change. Finally, you asked me to say a little bit about road transport policy. And I consulted my colleagues in the road transport team to give you kind of like four key policies to think about. Avoid diesel as far as possible. Diesel is certainly not clean, and vehicles before 2018 had significant, still high NOx emissions. I think people have probably heard about the Dieselgate scandal, where companies were basically falsifying their emissions. So if you're thinking about what cars are being imported, what your secondhand car fleet is, as far as possible, avoid diesels. If you do have remaining diesels, keep them out of city centres, keep them out of where the most population risk is. With that in mind, if you're thinking about urban policy and city policy, think about consolidation centres for trucks and for freight outside of your cities, and come up with policies so that clean vehicles are used for the last mile. Innovation is happening at lightning speed in this area, increase efficiencies in battery technology, renewables, etc. Don't just think about cars and trucks. Think about all the different types of electric vehicles that exist. Light vehicles, small vehicles, tuk-tuks, scooters can all be electrified, very cheaper by comparison. The most important thing is to think about, where possible, use the smallest, the lightest, most electric vehicle that you can for those last mile. And even in Europe, you see that there's all sorts of wonderful startups in city centres where cargo bikes and electric vehicles are now part of the delivery system. So yeah, that's sort of my key things on those three transport modes. Oh, can't hear you, Ramphal Institute.
Sorry. So I was going to come back to you on those points, a couple of points from that, but let me turn to John first. John, Lucy mentioned that they're trying to focus in the maritime industries and in switching or getting to more energy efficient types of fuels, or better, cleaner fuels. I know the IMO had called for a 3% reduction in sulfur emissions by 2020, but some argued that perhaps a lot of the reductions were already met by 2018, so were there going to be new targets? But it had also asked to have greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, so down from about 3.5% to about a 0.5%. Is that 2050 time frame just too long to be really impactful in getting the types of reductions that would be meaningful for addressing greenhouse gas issues? And what does that really mean for air pollution, particularly in the ports of small countries where you, on any given day, you can have as many as 5 or 6 cruise ships offloading thousands of people onto the shores of these economies?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I'm just gonna, if it's okay, I'm just gonna just explain a bit about IMO and the sulfur limit, and then I'll come back to your question after that. Because yeah, I think Lucy gave quite a good overall introduction to the sector. Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, just briefly what IMO does. For those who aren't familiar, it's the IMO is the international body for regulating international shipping, and it's basically a UN body that, and it's a mechanism for member states to make international regulation. And I'm responsible for MARPOL Annex 6. So IMO actually does, it's all regulation to do with safety and environment of ships. But MARPOL Annex 6 is the particular part just to do with air pollution and energy efficiency. And we yeah, it's quite a, we a very kind of highly kind of subscribed Convention. Like we have 99 ratifications now. We're waiting for 100. So the coverage of this international convention is very high, and which makes the discussion at IMO all that more important. I did check as well, because there are a number of Commonwealth countries that already that ratified MARPOL Annex 6. There's about a dozen. There's quite a few big countries and a few smaller countries as well. So there's a real mixture, and there's a couple of countries that are Commonwealth countries that also have quite big shipping fleets. So in that way, Commonwealth countries are quite active at IMO in the discussion. I've been at the IMO for a couple of years, and my kind of role, actually, as David explained quite well, is it's maintaining the data collection for ships and the EDI, which is so we have a existing energy efficiency standard for new ships already, which came into force in 2013. It's basically a design standard for ships, and ships have to meet this new standard, and this is tackling GHG emissions. And the other thing is, we also talk about emissions on two different ways. Like we have air pollution discussions, which covers SOx and NOx emissions, and we have energy efficiency and greenhouse gases. And Lucy alluded to it already, but the sulfur limit was quite a good example. So from the 1st of January 2020, all the ships, mainly covering large ships that are under this regulation, all ships in the world have to meet a sulfur limit. So they can only use fuel that has a 0.5% sulfur content. And by limiting the sulfur content in the fuel, that limits the SOx emissions. And this kind of worldwide transition to this lower sulfur fuel, it's been quite a successful experience, and it's quite a good example because although it's not just about setting the regulation, part of it is also we do a lot of work with developing countries. Before that, the sulfur limit came into force, I was traveling a few different places around the world. I was in Africa, for example, because you want to ensure that member states can, they can enforce the regulation, and they need to have the tools to do that. And we also have representatives from many different people from industry as well. So it does include ship owners, NGOs, as well as member states. And we also, in that example, there was also a lot of guidance to ship owners, because we wanted to ensure that ship owners could comply with the regulation and that they knew how to do that. So I'm just going to talk about on the GHG emission side. I did mention we've had this design standard for new ships, and that's been enforced since 2013, and the discussion now at IMO, which took place at the last session of the Marine Environmental Protection Committee. The committee approved operational standards, which will be adopted next session, which is basically regulation for existing ships, and that's quite a big thing, because traditionally a lot of regulation tends to be applied to new ships, and it kind of works. It's called like grandfathering. So new ships have to meet certain conditions, particularly with safety. You have this kind of thing, but now we're saying actually old ships also have to meet this energy efficiency criteria. So so that's been quite a monumental outcome. And this actually, what happened at this session actually is part of the IMO initial strategy as well, and this was adopted in 2018, and this sets the 2050 target, which you alluded to, and the 50% by 2050 as part of the strategy. And the strategy contains the targets, and it contains kind of ways that those targets can be met. So, and the other thing the strategy does mention as well, it does mention the importance of alternative fuels. and I think that's another important point, I think, which Lucy mentioned, about, if we really want to start decarbonising, then we do have to move away from fossil fuels. So the fact that member states have mentioned in the strategy that alternative fuels are quite integral to delivering the strategy, that's quite important, and that will be part of the upcoming discussion at IMO. Yeah, I was just going to say a couple of things as well. Just the other thing we have is we also have we publish these greenhouse gas studies, which kind of show the state of the industry, and they're very sophisticated studies. And the last one was just recently approved. So we know from this that actually we do expect, if we do nothing, the emissions will increase, CO2 emissions will increase, and shipping is actually 3% of, well, it's 2.9% of worldwide emissions in 2018. Yeah, the other thing I was going to say was just, I think you have to be kind of careful with some comparisons as well. I know some comparisons are made like, oh, shipping pollutes as much as this many million cars. But the thing to take note is that if you look at how efficient ships are in terms of the cargo they transport, they're actually pretty efficient. It's at least kind of 3 times or 4 times more efficient than cars. A lot of cars aren't really, a lot of cars don't have a lot of people in, where ships, in terms of cargo transported, they're actually quite efficient already. Yeah, okay. The last thing, yeah, I was going to say, yeah, I think, yeah, so I just talk a little bit about the 2050 target, kind of in response to your question, David, because I think it's quite important. There's actually 3 targets there as well. So the 2050 target, the 50% reduction, is probably the most ambitious because it's a sector target. It's actually saying that because it's on the whole sector, if we expect the sector to increase in size, so that it actually means that individual ships have to be, if this sector is allowed to increase in size, then maybe for individual ships they have to decrease their emissions by about 70%, which is quite large, and the only way you can kind of reach those kind of reductions that are set out in the strategy is actually to use alternative fuels.
John, I wanted to, thanks for that. I wanted to press you just on that point of the ship-cars comparison, because I think in a sense I understand what you're saying, but cars are not necessarily designed to carry cargo. I think what was being alluded to there was maybe the efficiency or the type of fuels that ships burn. And I know that some ships burn what's called bunker oil, when they're at certain points, which is a heavy polluting type of thing. So I mean, the reason we raise it is because I spoke to several policymakers in the tourism sector in the Caribbean, and I've had responses from 2 in the South Pacific, and their point to me was, well, we don't even think of that. Nobody has ever really raised that on our radar for us, about the air pollution issues that are caused by ships when they're in port. And then there's like, well, if that's the case, what about the thousands of women who work in these areas at cruise ports as hair braiders and arts and craft and all of that? And many times they have their young children with them. So, I mean, I think it's interesting. And I think it's laudable that the IMO is pushing to have these massive reductions, and that you have, when I did check, it was 99 of your 173 members who have now signed up to it. Many of them are small island states. But is it really that the ships are more efficient? I mean, I did see one very glaring claim jump out at me, which said 15 of the world's largest ships actually emit more pollution than all the cars in the world. So I thought, if you wanted to make a ship car comparison, if I tried to fit all of the cars in the world onto those 15 ships, they probably wouldn't fit. You'd have a few of them falling off into the sea. But past that, the point is, are the reductions that are being put forward by countries on the MARPOL Annex 6, is that going to effectively reduce the health implications on populations and the ports and areas they're in? I know in India, for instance, they have ships that enter into their maritime areas have to meet environmental standards, but the Indian authorities will be very quick to let you know that the monitoring side of air pollution now is not up to scratch. So I want to press you just a little bit on that to see what you think. What really do states have at the wherewithal to respond to this more effectively?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about the comparison and kind of what I mean. I don't have an exact numbers, but what I mean, like for example, is ships are very efficient at carrying the kind of miles per gallon, I guess, of per cargo carried. They're super efficient. So when you're comparing the 16 biggest ships in the world, these ships are probably doing long voyages. And they're carrying like millions of tons of cargo. So the fuel used per cargo is very small. That's kind of what I mean. Whereas when you can compare that to a car, the kind of fuel used it'll be like per person moved or cargo moved is actually really high. So some ships are actually super efficient in that sense. That's what I was kind of getting at. So you do have to be careful with those kind of comparisons. They're just very different. Yeah. So. And I was gonna, a little bit more about you were saying about local impacts, and I think it's important. If you ratify MARPOL Annex 6, then that does give member states can then put their own local restrictions on. There's a few ways this can be done. And I think Lucy alluded to, we have emission control areas. So for example, in Europe, there's a 0.1% sulfur limit. So if you're a country that's concerned, a member state that's concerned about local pollution, you can use these, you can set your own restrictions just for yourself. But if you wanted to do restrictions with other countries, you could discuss this, having emission control areas. There's also a discussion going on at the moment about having additional emission control areas with, more stringent standards in the Mediterranean. And the other thing, so this is through IMO, but there's also a thing called UNCLOS, which is the United Nations Convention Law of the Sea, and that's another thing that allows countries to enforce, within their own waters and have their own standards. I think a good example of this is what we've seen with SOx scrubbers, which is a way of some ships they can still use higher sulfur fuel, but if they put a scrubber on board to lower the SOx emissions to below the level of what it would be if you were using the compliant fuel. But a lot of countries don't like the exhaust gas scrubbers because they some of the how they're used, they go into the water and they're concerned that maybe this isn't good for the environment. But it's a good example because we actually see a lot of countries impose. You can see how countries can, if they want to, they impose a lot of local restrictions, and you see it a lot in especially places like Norway, for example. They have their own restrictions they don't allow any SOx scrubbers at all, and because they want to protect the fjords. So countries can do this as well as supporting MARPOL Annex 6. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm reading before I go to Michael, because we don't want to lose out hearing of what's happening in Uganda with all these cars that are coming, Mike. But as Lucy pointed out here, poor air quality due to international shipping accounts for approximately 400,000 premature deaths. I mean, I think the point we're trying to get from
from the perspective of what Commonwealth countries need to understand is exactly the impact that the different forms of air pollution are having on human health. And I think it's not a matter of pointing fingers, it's more a matter of trying to size up really the scale of the problem. So when you think about the fact that you have air pollution from transportation, you have indoor air pollution, you have pollution from agricultural practice, you have from industrial practice, it is a lot. And we had a meeting last night with a panelist who will come on on green technologies, our fourth webinar, where it's just absolutely exciting about the technologies that they're trying to deploy. Michael, I wanted to come to you because you're in a unique situation there in Uganda. As you said, you don't really have beaches, you have lakes, and but you have everybody driving all of these cars that are being imported. They're secondhand cars that don't meet emission standards anymore in developed countries, but they're being shipped to countries in Africa and the Caribbean and other places. Many of them are Commonwealth countries. Tell us a little bit more about what you're doing and the realities on the ground, because you've talked about the fact that you're fighting an uphill battle in trying to get people to understand the health impacts of that, women and children in particular.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everybody. First, I'll start by giving you a small overview of what the country is doing. And we are not so much into aviation and shipping, but I'll just hint a little bit concerning how Africa, generally in East Africa, we are handling. So first of all, the problem of air pollution in Uganda accounts for more than 31,000 deaths, like annually. That's from around the 2017 survey. And transport contributes to more than 65% of the pollution, because we don't have much railway transport. Air transport is there, but not much as well. We also have water transport, but road transport is the culprit here, because when you look at it, the biggest part of the road networks in the country are not yet tarmacked. We are still running on maram roads. So you find that particulate matter contains a lot of resuspended dust, diesel, NOx, carbon dioxide. It's massive. So you find that the government is really doing great. And actually, one of the key issues they're trying to solve is fighting traffic congestion from the city centers. Kampala being the capital and also the central business area of the country, it has the heaviest level of pollution and traffic congestion. Kampala has about 1.5 million people inhabitants, but during day, on a work day, you find that another 1.5 are coming to the city for different businesses. So literally about 3 million people are in Kampala every day, and you find that most of them are driving. And so they are trying to limit pollution by fighting traffic congestion and then building a better road infrastructure. And one of these is they introduced the rapid bus transit. We don't have a mass transport system yet, but it's in proposal. I cannot tell exactly when it will take effect, but they always talk about it. And then also the emissions testing of vehicles, because like I said, most of them, actually over 80% of vehicles in Uganda, they come used. And then the fact that, yes, they say that these vehicles are inspected before prior shipment, but there's no evidence on how efficient these inspections are working, because many of them come with issues. So, and then also this inspection system, it was introduced in 2017, but due to legislative matters, actually, one of the biggest problems we have political, we have regulatory and technical issues. They are all in the mix that are making some of these interventions the government is setting up to not work well. So I will not go much into those, but we have recently had, there's a project by Makerere University, it's called AirCo, And we are soon partnering with this. There's a pilot project we are going to be running the next 1 month together. And this one is in the monitoring part. So one of the solutions is to monitor the air pollution, to understand what solutions can be deployed to reduce the rate of air pollution. So we have started on monitoring. Initially, we used to have only like 2 from the Ministry of Environment and then from the American Embassy website. But now there's also, so we have about 25 sensors within the Kampala area that are monitoring the air quality. So that's a big milestone for the country. And then also the city authorities have introduced the what we call the non-motorized corridors in the city center. There's one pilot just right within the city center where like cars or vehicles are not allowed to pass through. However, there's also another problem with enforcement, because you find that motorcycles that happen to be some of the most polluters are still using that. So enforcement is quite a problem, but this is also another good solution that we are looking at.
Sorry, are you guys doing electrification in the sector there? I mean, I know the number of motorbikes on the road and tuk-tuks and small cars. I mean, what about electrification with transport system? Is that something that you're looking at, or is?
Yeah, we're still coming to that. There's another project which is backed up by government. It's called the Kira Motors. These ones, they are working on producing buses, electric buses. They showcased about 2 of them in about a year back, and a facility is being built. And I think right now it's close to 70% done. It's in the eastern part of the country. And they are going to be producing a reasonable number of buses every year, so that most of these Matatu taxis, 14-seater minibuses, they are the commonest means of public transport. So they want to replace these with electric buses. So that's the first government project on electrification of transport. And now coming to what we are doing, we have this program with Auto Safety Uganda, and actually it's quite a new concept to both the government and other people, because we started this in 2017 as a community-based project. But then after gaining a few resources, we were able to grow into a non-government organization. And the concept is Uganda, as a Commonwealth country, you find that the standards and regulations they set in place, some of them are more of a copy and paste from basically our colonial masters, Britain. You find that policies that are working out there, they want to bring them here. Yes, it's really great, but then from the African point of view, we have challenges that are making those regulations and policies failing to work the way they're intended to. Because in Africa, we have this challenge of too many second-hand vehicles. They are too polluting. And then another key factor that nobody has ever looked at, except us, but you find that local technicians, what the ones you usually refer to as mechanics, they are the people that most people trust. Actually, even when someone is going to buy a vehicle, they always consult with their mechanic, which vehicle can I buy? But this mechanic knows nothing about how efficient this vehicle is. This mechanic doesn't know anything about emissions control, because the problem is that over 90% of them never had formal training in their lines of business. They, simply much, if they can find a garage they learn basic repairs from, they start from there and then they build. And many of them have turned into good mechanics, but most of them, they are still having very limited capacity in terms of skills and then equipment to use. Yeah. So you find that these used vehicles meeting the underdeveloped road network with limited capacity mechanics, in a short time, they are worse than they were. And the fact that we do not have an active system yet on emissions testing, that's another factor. You find that if a vehicle, let's say if I compare a vehicle in the UK that was made in 1996, it would be at least better than a vehicle in Uganda, which was made in 2010, and it came in Uganda in 2010, because it takes a very little time for it to get bad. Emission controls go bad and they can't be fixed. So with this Auto Safety Uganda, we chose to take this path to supplement whatever the government has put in place and other private entities to make sure that the general public and these technicians and everybody else as a stakeholder understands how transport is leading to deterioration of our health and to the environment, because like Lucy said, air pollution is also a key driver in climate change. So if we fight air pollution, then we shall be able to deal with climate change as well.
Yeah.
So basically what we are trying to achieve here, because you find that regulations in the country still, like I was saying, we have regulatory mixed with political and technical issues within whatever the government is setting up. So you find that people, the vulnerable people, the children and the women are not catered for in the policies they are setting. You find that these places for the technical people, the mechanics, you find a garage right next to a school or a children's hospital, and everybody was working normally. And in these garages, a lot of things happen. First, you find that in garages, being a mechanic, I know what happens there. We do a lot of idling, you know, after maybe an engine overhaul. A car can be, like an engine can be on idling for like literally over 5 hours, you know, trying to test how it's coping up. And you find people doing auto body sprays in the open. There's no protection actually for their health and then for the health of people around them. So, and then you realize that what the government is trying to do, they are fixing the symptoms, but then their causes, they are not trying to look at. So we are trying to make sure that these policymakers understand, and if they could get a concept like this, if they could support it, actually, one of our wishes is that if the rest of African countries that are similarly challenged, if they can take on such a project, a concept, you would find that if they can get technical people to work from a sustainable point of view, you would find that even these second-hand vehicles, even though they come emitting, the emissions rate would reduce. And then it will also give us a smooth transit into better technologies like electrification, cleaner fuels, because right here, electrification is not known actually even to this people who are driving cars. Some of them, we've tried to interact with them and they're like, I can't imagine an electric car. Yet out there, this is being a real solution. So it's quite difficult, like I said, because we are still a startup. It's quite difficult pushing through, but we believe from our point of view, this is going to work, because another part we are trying to take in the same aspect is if we can convert the same vehicles that we have, because we have about 2 million vehicles in the road, 2 million, and that's including motorcycles. So if we could convert some of them from running on fuel to electrification, like running on to become battery electric vehicles, then that's a bit more cost effective, because with the rate of motorization and urbanization in the country, you find that most people cannot afford to buy brand new cars.
Yeah.
So whether they're electric or not, most people cannot afford that. So still, that will make this. Excuse me, you're saying something?
No, I wanted to pick up on that point of electrification, because I had a question for Lucy. I know that in the transport sector, electrification is now a sexy thing, and everybody wants to chase electrification. But as Michael is saying, there are significant constraints to it. I'm trying to figure out, can you give us some insights into what the challenges are in the shipping and aviation sector? Is electrification a viable alternative, or?
For shipping, yes. For In port operations and for short sea shipping, we already have electric vessels operating in Europe, quite a number of ferries and short sea and inland shipping vessels. So the technology is there, and we will see big leaps forward as battery technology improves. I mean, already we're exceeding whatever ideas we had about battery technology a few years ago. You know, it's really advancing very fast. But, you know, it's unlikely we'll be able to have fully electric ships for like long and deep sea shipping, but certainly it can be combined with other propulsion technologies, because really electrification compared to other, you know, synthetic fuels, it's a much more efficient use of renewable technology. You take 100 units of energy, you put it into a battery, and with a motor you get about 79, 80 units of energy back out. If you have to manufacture that renewable energy into either a hydrogen fuel, you'd get 50% of that energy back. If you were making synthetic diesel, you'd only get 13% efficiency. Wow. So, you know, where possible, we must electrify. It's the most efficient use of our renewable resources, but there are limits, as you said. For aviation, yeah, electric aircraft is very short distances. You know, I'd say that, you know, rather than really thinking that you know, electric aircraft we should be looking at other forms of land transport, you know, electric train networks, etc., for replacing those kind of distances, because you're not going to be able to go very far with electric aircraft, even with the great innovations that are in the pipeline for the next for the coming decades. And yeah, I hear Michael's challenges. You know, electric vehicles do seem to be, you know, they are expensive, and maybe they are a luxury for the developed world. And that's why, you know, it's important to not just think about, you know, standard cars. You know, cars are actually quite heavy, inefficient ways of transporting people. You know, we need to think about other sorts of vehicles that are lighter, more efficient, and therefore have lower energy demands from those batteries. And, you know, just think about, you know, don't follow the developing world's path for, you know, transportation. You know, leapfrog, you know, not to end up with congestion and air pollution, but to think of, you know, public transport, electrifying public transport. Buses, trucks are all possible to be electrified now. So, you know, think of more efficient ways of doing it. That would be sort of our advice. But, you know, if all else fails and you're in an area which has local sustainable forms of biofuels, then you could be using those for the remaining combustion engines that you might have. But, you know, you need to be very careful about unwanted land use change associated with the scaling of biofuels.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Actually, another point to note is that while I think the government authorities were caught unaware, or they just didn't plan well, because land use, when you connect land use and the transport systems, you find that it's kind of a mix-up. There's a disconnect. So you find that people being crowded in the city center, causing a lot of congestion, is partly because of they didn't plan well. So you find that somebody to find a good school for their children, it has to be close to the city. So, and then businesses, offices, so if they could plan earlier, so if the government could do, it requires to go back to the drawing board. What we are doing in the auto sector.
The charging network, Mike, sorry, the charging network is what's going to be important. So in places like Barbados, where they've rolled out a network, it was a private sector initiative that had a lot of resistance from government and from traditional car salesmen initially. Mm-hmm. But then now the different diplomatic embassies that are there have transformed or changed all of their fleets, their vehicle fleets to electric. The courier services have changed their fleets to electric. And these are things I think that can work in other countries. They can work in certainly in Uganda and other places. It has to be that mind shift with the network rolling out that gets people going. And that's when, I mean, you're starting to see now where it's taking up more and more of an appeal. I did some work in Botswana about 5 years ago, and I remember talking then about the possibility of establishing solar grids for electric water heating and stuff, and there just was no readiness to absorb that. I think that has changed in many countries.
Mhm.
But I want to go back to an earlier point because I don't want to miss it. Questions have been raised, John, about whether or not the IMO, its rules, and the changes or the reductions of emissions that it has put in place, whether or not that will be effective. And Transport and Environment has a study that argues that it ignores the Paris Agreement, or it doesn't meet the obligations for that. Not that it eschews it, but that it doesn't meet the obligations for that. What does that really mean then for countries that are really on the policy receiving ends? Because as many of the small island states would say, well, we don't own the ships. And as was pointed out in the conversations, it's not people from our countries that are traveling on board the cruise lines, and the containers don't. Do you really think, John, that the reduction agreements that have been put in place really help we'll see emissions from ships reducing over the next several decades, or will that continue to grow? Is it that the reality is that will continue to grow?
Thanks. I was just going to, sorry, very quickly, just make a comment on what Lucy said, and then I'll answer your question, because I was just listening about, she was saying about electrification and things. Yeah, and I just think it's a good point on just generally on fuels as well, because electrification is just for short sea ships. Like if you, if you have just pure electric ships, using current lithium ion technology, you'd need like 40 times the weight, to carry that compared to oil. And I think that's the interesting thing we have with shipping, is that with the way the different options we're looking at to decarbonize and looking at alternative fuels, we're potentially looking at fuels which are much harder, which might have some constraints or harder to work with. So, like some fuels that are being discussed, like ammonia, hydrogen, LNG is being used already, but all of these fuels have a lower kind of energy density, and it's something that you have to consider in the future. Is that we could potentially be using a fuel where we may not be able to carry as much fuel as ships carry now. You may need to potentially bunker more often, or or do something differently. I would say, I know you did mention about perhaps some, I understand what you're saying about, in some countries you do get the cruise ships visiting, and you've got hundreds of people on board, and maybe you're small island state, so you would get a big impact from that. I would say that there are mechanisms already in place for the countries to do that. Through Marplanet 6 or UNCLOS, people can set their own regional standards on emissions. So there are ways that can be done. I think sometimes it's a balance as well, because I use the Fords for example, because I went there recently, and I remember we were on it wasn't a particularly big ship, but you're on kind of a big boat cruising through the Fords, and then you stop at this town, but then the town there is in the middle of nowhere, and they just depend completely on this kind of tourist trade going through the town. So it's kind of like, well, Norway probably wouldn't ever ban cruise ships, but what they've done is they've put regulation in to stop them using scrubbers. So they've tried to keep them clean, but they do depend upon the tourism. So sometimes there's kind of this balance as well. Particularly if you're a developing country, you depend on the tourism income. and the other thing you mentioned was about the you know, the levels of ambition in the initial strategy. So the Paris Agreement is much more stringent, which is about, you know, decarbonizing, you know, as soon as possible, this goes towards the 50%, and what it actually says is, it says with a view to you know, you know, decarbonize around 2100. So it's actually kind of a bit further timescale. And yeah, so some of this is also because it is an agreement by many member countries, and it, you know, it's something that takes a while to discuss and come upon an agreement what the reduction rates are. There are ambitious targets, but it's also, it does represent, you know, the view of many different people, and I think that's the thing that's so significant about that initial strategy, because it's an agreement between you know, the 99 member states to agree to the same piece of text, and there's also some you know, there's a number of different concerns as well. You know, it also, there's some developing countries, like for example, where, especially at the moment, you know, for them, they can't really face any kind of increase in cost. So their concern is that if you have to put measures in place, or, you know, or they have to, you know, paying more for fuel, then that's going to increase the cost of things in their country. And if you're a country, you know, a developing country, then it, you know, is quite a massive concern to have. So we do get those concerns. And I think the other thing is the way that IMO works as well. It's different to other UN organizations because every country is also treated the same. So that's why you kind of end up with this global standard for everyone. But I do think that's important as well. Because I think the sulfur limit is, you know, quite a good example. You know, everyone has exactly the same 0.5% limit, regardless of the country. So that's the thing that's been difficult in some of the GHG discussions. It has, you know, everyone has been treated the same.
Yeah, John, thanks for that. I mean, I hear the point you're making on the cost, but there's a cost to business. There's also a cost to humanity. There's a cost to society. Lucy, you've been making the point that our transport environment makes the point that the new carbon emission reduction measures of the world fleet are just not going to go down based on the targets that have been set. Talk to us a little bit more about that, to say, I mean, what is it really then that countries can do? What can Commonwealth countries really, is there really a policy option for them, or measures that can be taken, or what's the scenario?
Yeah, well, yeah, I just want to kind of come back on the IMO greenhouse gas strategy a little bit, and in answering this, because, you know, first to say that the current IMO strategy is not compatible with the Paris Agreement. If you're looking at what the proportion of emissions are from shipping right now, and if you were to reduce those emissions in line with what is needed with a fair carbon budget, we would be needing to hit zero emissions for shipping by 2035 for the 1.5 target to be met. And the 1.5 target is important because the difference between 1.5 temperature increase and 2 degrees is the difference between whether we have any coral reefs left or not. You know, coral reefs, you know, are just one kind of indicator, one tipping point in this whole climate story, but a very important one, particularly for island nations, you know, for fisheries, etc. So it's very, very important that we raise the ambition at the IMO so that we are meeting that temperature goal. Now, we talked about the strategy has short, medium and long-term goals. So this is stuff to be done before 2025, stuff to be done before 2030, stuff to be done before 2050. The short-term goals that have been developed at the IMO for existing fleet don't go anywhere near far enough to be able for us to be bringing those emissions down in line with the Paris Agreement. The recent negotiations in November will lead to a 1.6% reduction maximum on business as usual. I've added some links and some information into the chat. So that's kind of the starting point. But then you ask, well, what can countries do? And I would say that the IMO has a very unique structure compared to other UN bodies. It's based on flag states, and the power you have depends on the number of the ships in your fleet. This means that there are a number of countries that might be small countries in terms of people, but have large numbers of ships in their fleet, and they have a lot of power. And so I would say to citizens of those countries, take a look and see whether your country and what's happening at the IMO lines up with what you need in terms of air pollution and climate action, and call on your nation to represent your interests as civil society at the IMO, for starters. And you know, and the importance of shipping doing its part. Yes, of course, you know, the developing world is vulnerable to price increases from shipping, but we've done a lot of work on impact assessments of climate action from shipping. And what we see is that actually for consumer products, bringing in ambitious climate regulation and switching fuels would not lead to a significant increase in the price of goods. So, you know, we have information that we can provide supporting that. But, you know, what can we do in the short term? Actually, there is a lot that we could do to make shipping more efficient. We could slow down the shipping fleet. There's a cubic relationship between the amount of fuel you burn and at the speed you go and the amount of fuel you burn. So, you know, actually a modest reduction in speed would bring down emissions. And there's an awful lot of efficiency technology that hasn't yet been deployed in the fleet. So having measures in place to make sure that we're really building the most efficient ships that we can build with the most efficient technology that we have, and slowing the fleet down and putting in place industrial policy to support the transition to zero emission fuels. So yeah, I think important thing for countries is look at your IMO policy, look at your climate and your air pollution policy, and make sure those are aligned and that we're fighting for the highest ambition that we can get.
Yeah. Lucy, let me come back to you for quick closing thoughts before I move on to Mike and John. So any additional recommendations or considerations from your end that countries should take on board when thinking about aviation, shipping, and the whole issue of air pollution?
Hello?
I think I lost her for a minute there.
Please come again.
No, I was saying, as a part of a closing comment, I was asking more Lucy if she had any final thoughts that, for countries in terms of aviation and shipping. Anything else that governments, policymakers need to take on board, community activists need to be aware of when looking at aviation, shipping, and the matter of air pollution?
Yeah, so maybe it's a little bit like a philosophical point around governance. We should not be drawn into debates of whether we should do this at a global level or a regional level. We need to take action at all levels. We need a polycentric and plural governance approach. This means we need to be developing policies that align and meet global goals at a local, at a national, at a regional and a supranational level. It is not helpful to say we should only be active in this UN space, or we should only be active in this regional space. We need to do both. And you know, from my point of view as someone active in a regional space, it's really, really important that we have a regional European strategy for shipping to take ownership of the emissions that relate to our trade, and to put in place plans to decarbonize those ships and those planes. Similarly for aviation, you know, we need to own the emissions from planes departing from our airports, and we need to come up with strategies to cap those emissions and to switch the fuels and to design new aircraft. We cannot tackle this just at a UN, ICAO or IMO level. We need to do it coming at it from both angles. So I would say, you know, let's get out of this that debate. You know, let's get out of those divides and let's make sure that we come with plans from the bottom up as well as from the top down.
Thank you very much for that, Lucy. John, what do you think needs to be done from the shipping side, from the IMO side of things? I see Nicholas has been asking about whether or not NGOs or Commonwealth organizations are able to access the IMO. Is it that from the civil society side, we need to start thinking about partnerships with governments or partnerships or with other organizations? What your closing thoughts on what you think countries can do?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry, I did just send an email to Nicholas quickly because we do. I mean, there is a limited number of people who can, you know, get involved in the discussion. You do have to be an NGO or member states. But saying this, you know, a lot of the work at IMO is publicly available, and there are ways to get involved. I just wanted to say a couple of things. I guess in some comments in response to Lucy as well. So what we do have now, actually, we do have this agreement now is the short-term measures. It does what it is kind of a rating system for existing ships, and it's kind of just the first part of the initial strategy, the kind of short-term plan. So there's a lot more work on issues related to GHG emissions. There's still a lot that the committee has to discuss, and this current measure, what it does is quite good. Is it provides a framework by essentially rating ships and then comparing existing ships. The other thing I just wanted to say, and again, this, I think Lucy touched on this a bit. It isn't just an IMO thing. It's we understand that a lot of the investment for these future fuels, for example, it has to be made on land for those fuels to be produced and provided by ships. The majority will actually be on land. And I think I've seen some numbers, this is billions of pounds worth of investment. And it does cross sectors. And I think that's quite an important thing. And I think that's kind of been my experience with looking at GHG emissions in general. You do need to consider outside just your sector. The fuels are another good example, because traditionally IMO's rules are more about we look at operational ship performance, but now we're starting to have discussions about the full life cycle of fuels, because for example, if you make hydrogen from fossil fuel, then it's not actually that going to be that much better. So you want to make sure that you make these fuels from renewable sources, and there's a lot of people who have different parts to play. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Michael, I've been sitting here thinking you really need to connect with a lot of what's happening in India, and I need to put you in touch with the people who are building out the network in Barbados. I just saw, I think it was earlier in the week, Lucy might have posted something on through LinkedIn, which said that the technology has changed now in China, where you can pull up to a electric charging station and have your car recharge from empty to full in about the same time it would have taken you to fill your tank with regular gasoline or petrol. So I mean, and then we've had discussions at the Ramphal Institute with previous webinars where we have seen that the technology that's being rolled out in Delhi and other places, in Chennai, across India, where you have the tuk-tuks now, they drive up to these battery stations, they switch out the battery that's been run down, use a fob card, tap that, grab a new battery, plug that in, and they're good to go for another couple hours again. And these networks are being built out. So I think there's quite a bit there for you, perhaps that we could help to link you on. What are your final thoughts on what needs to happen, you think, in Uganda within the road transport sector to achieve the shift that you've been talking about?
Yeah, actually, on that point of conversion, a little bit, there's a company called Zembo. We are trying to establish contact. They have this network. They have electric motorcycles where they switch batteries, like you were trying to explain. So they have centers. The rider would go and pick a new battery for a small fee, because they don't have cards yet, for a small fee. And actually, one battery, I was told, gives about 90 to 100 kilometers. So, and they have some centers. So this is quite innovative. But then we would want to integrate this, that if we can still convert more, because with the over 100,000 imports of new, because motorcycles don't come old, they come new, but over 100,000 of them are imported every year. So, and if we can still to convert these ones that are already existing to electricity and then use the same system, it would be great. So to wrap up on what we are doing, our focus is to reduce emissions from transport, but also from industry and domestic activities. But the primary target groups are local mechanics, because these people are key stakeholders that are not accounted for anywhere in the policies or regulations. So if we could get them to work sustainably, we are aiming at achieving better combustion for these vehicles, to enhance tailpipe emission control systems, so that, because one of the common issues that we have seen from the technical point, when a car gets issues, usually like especially these oxygen sensors, when they go wrong, the cut converters also begin cause issues to the engine. So usually they remove them. So they bypass it in such a way that an engine emits all those toxic gases to the atmosphere directly without any treatment. So we are trying to build their capacity to maintain these emission control systems to work the way they are meant to work, and even to enhance them. So, and also promote use of cleaner fuels, and then also to cut non-exhaust emissions, because now we have another problem in Africa of having counterfeit parts and accessories for vehicles, because they are cheap. You find brake pads that can wear out in a very short time, and these non-exhaust emissions have no any form of regulations or anything per se. So if we could get these people to understand that quality is better, because the traders themselves, they bring what sells, and then people are also buying them because they are cheap. So if the public can understand that, if we can at least try to use quality service parts, this will reduce on the amount of emissions that are emitted by vehicles. And then also another thing is like tires. Recently, the Uganda Revenue Authority, they confiscated a lot of goods, people who are dealing in tires. Many of them were found to be substandard. They easily wear out. So these are some of the issues we are trying to look at. So once we get the public to understand that everybody has a part to play in this, the motorists, the people using transport, the riders, and the mechanics themselves, then at least we are going to be able to understand these oncoming technologies. Like when the electric buses come, we shall understand them better. When electrical vehicles, fully electric, begin rolling in, we shall welcome them because we know the benefits. But right now, you find that usually the government brings in policies and regulations without having to educate the masses. So we want to get the public to understand how we are gaining from this, and then how the environment is gaining from this, our climate.
Yeah.
So in this, we are really focusing on protection of children from air pollution, because they are the most vulnerable. Actually, some of them are even affected while they're still in their mother's wombs. So actually, we are trying to see that ambient air pollution reduces, and then we move on to because also indoor air pollution is also a problem where people use unclean energy systems to cope. So it's quite a lot of work to do, and any kind of partnerships and connections we get is going to move us steps closer to achieving our goal.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me say thank you to John, Lucy, and Michael today. I mean, I think what the discussion has pointed out, certainly has illuminated, is that there still is a lot of awareness building that has to take place. People still don't fully understand what the impact of air pollution from the different forms of transportation is, what it involves, what the policy issues really are. And
Yes,
what we're also seeing, one second, Mike, is that the vulnerable groups are not having a voice in how and what's being articulated and how they engage in the process. I think that's going to be important going forward. Hopefully, the part of the process of what we're trying to achieve by this initiative at the Ramphal Institute is to raise the awareness, to enhance a desire for building and strengthening partnerships to tackle the issues, and to get policymakers to look more critically at what is happening in the areas of air pollution, in particular as it relates to human health. I think if we can get those things to happen, we would have had really good successes. Mike, let me just go back to you to close out in 1 minute. So.
Yeah, the one other point I want to talk about is water transport. Though we don't have much of shipping, but there are lots of business moving around because we have this shared Lake Victoria. There's a lot of transportation happening on it. And one other issue we looked at is these motorized boats, the outboards.
Yeah.
We found that many of them are using two-stroke engines, and these engines they burn fuel and oil at the same time because they don't have internal lubrication system. So we are also looking at having to convert them from using electricity, like for them to become electric. We are still doing research on that, but it's also something we are looking at least to reduce, because the emissions from the concept is the same. The people who are maintaining these outboards are usually the same people who are maintaining motorcycles, and sometimes the same people who are maintaining cars. We have no specialty in this area. So we find that if we can achieve better maintenance in vehicles, we shall achieve better maintenance in motorcycles, and we shall achieve better maintenance in outboards for water transport. And this also will enhance our conversion from fossil fuels to electric.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank everyone today for joining us for this, the first webinar in a series by the Ramphal Institute that's focused on air pollution. As I mentioned, we do get support for this from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in New Delhi. We're very grateful for that. I would like to invite all of you to join us for our next webinar in 2 weeks' time. So every fortnight, the next one is going to be on indoor air pollution. And that has a lot of exciting things to talk about there. But thank you very much for joining us today. And a copy of this webinar will be available on the Ramphal Institute's website and its YouTube account as well. Thank you all, and all have a good day. Bye-bye.